So in TFT there's items and traits that grant units extra size, but there's no apparent scaling that size provides, so it can just seem like a gimmick, but there's actually a few things that size affects. In this video I'll go through some findings regarding size and try to answer what does size actually do in TFT. The first thing I looked at is how size affects travel distance, because surely a larger unit would need fewer steps to reach a target. To test this, I found it difficult to use Titan's Resolve, so I decided to use Mecha Prime as it instantly grants a larger unit size and is much easier to observe. But since there's an animation when a mech transforms at the beginning of combat, there is a slight delay before that unit starts moving. So what I did is find the frame just before the units start moving and sync the footage together so we can watch both versions of Jack's move simultaneously and compare. This should be accurate to around a 60th of a second, as the recording was at 60 FPS. Anyway, from this recording with two target dummies in the farthest corner, we can see that Mech Jax reaches the dummy sooner, and when the first dummy dies, Mech Jax is much faster at altering the second as he autos before he starts his pathing. This is really interesting in and of itself, and I'll cover this extensively in the next section. Let's look at a more realistic positioning with a dummy at the front and a dummy at the back. You can see that there's not really a noticeable difference between them, bar the fact that Jax autos the dummy during his pathing. Again, I'll cover this in the next section. With the dummies just slightly in from the corners, we can see that Mech Jax is faster, but again, the difference is really small, even when pathing to a new target. But that may be due to Mech Jax finishing his animation. A weird exception is this clip here, with the dummies at the opposite corners of the backline. Mech Jax is just slightly faster at reaching the first dummy, but because he's finishing his animation and he paths downward 1 hex, he's slightly slower when reaching the second. I have no clue why he pathed down here. Now, this clip is the most interesting because of a few reasons. First off, the Jaxes have slightly different paths, but they both target the same dummy and then they aggro onto the other. Which is really interesting for Mech Jax because he could have aggroed the Vi instead of repositioning to the same spot as a small Jax and aggroing onto the second dummy. Since both Jaxes aggro onto the second dummy rather than Vi, it seems that the pathing here is to put the unit in a spot so they can both have targets in range and quickly shift if one target dies. This means that small Jax has slightly less downtime in this case because the mech can't fit in between these dummies because he's too big. But one thing we can determine here is that size affects pathing. It seems that the pathing is preset and predetermined, and Mech Jax was unable to execute his pathing until the obstruction was gone, after which he took the same position as small Jax. This may mean that if you're against a mech, it could be better to position like this, where you place your less important units diagonally in front rather than horizontally to limit the space that the mech can be in and to delay the time it takes for the mech to be within range of your more important units. These tests did lead me to wonder how size scales with movement speed. It could produce great results with things like Nunu in set 8 or Cavalier back in set 7. But this was difficult to test because Nunu doesn't auto at all, so he can't get Titan stacks by himself and he needs to take damage for those stacks. And it can be a bit deceiving after he gets those stacks because Nunu's ult grants him movement speed, so it's difficult to observe this interaction. It does seem that because Nunu is bigger, he needs to travel less, but this could just be a misobservation. For example, as Titan's Resolve is made from a recurve bow, each Titans will grant Nunu 10% attack speed, which he then converts into movement speed. So these Nunus on the top start with bonus movement speed. Also, the bottom Nunus are gaining more mana and casting more often because they're mitigating less of Urgot's damage as they have less armor. And you can see how Nunu's pathing can really be inconsistent from round to round. And it's really hard to run more tests because of how necessary target dummies are, since they stay in the same spot without following Nunu, so Nunu travels the width of the board. You also need a damage source to get Nunu his Titan stacks, and you need the enemy units to survive long enough for good observations and comparisons, so this can be really difficult to work with. Overall, it does seem that greater size reduces the travel distance of units, although the difference is small. But let me be clear here that size does not affect unit speed. Their movement speed is not changing, rather this is more like the steps they're taking become bigger or the strides they take are larger. So in some instances we saw Mech Jax deal damage mid-path before small Jax. Why is this? Well, first let's see how size works in League of Legends, since a lot of the rules are shared between TFT and League. So this sentence here describes a relationship that determines the hitbox radius of a unit based on model size and the selection box size, which is like the targetable areas on a unit. So if we think back to TFT, increasing size is increasing the model scale of a unit, which then also means that the hitbox radius of the unit is increasing. And I think that the pathing radius also applies in TFT, because even though the pathing was usually identical from small jacks to mech jacks, we saw instances of Jax's pathing changing, but the only variable was his unit size. And it seems like the pathing is predetermined unless there is something obstructing the path, like the size of the unit. And unless obstructed, these units will always walk the same predetermined path and end up in the same destination. But we saw Mech Jax walk his predetermined path and auto the dummy when he only should have been in auto range when he reached the end of his path. So what I think is going on is that since Jax's hitbox radius has gotten bigger, the area in which he can auto targets has increased even though Jax's range is still the same. With a larger size, there can be multiple spots during the path where that 1 hex range overlaps with the target. Basically, Jax's base model radius has increased, and as Jax travels his predetermined pathing, he's actually in range of the target here, but then he continues his pathing. So in these situations, a larger unit size can result in more damage because your unit can auto the targets before the end of its path, as those targets were within reach. You can actually see a much clearer example of this on Riot Kent's Twitter with this Cho'Gath clip. Cho'Gath wants to path somewhere here to target Sivir, but you can see that Cho gets a really early auto in and then continues his path, which is kinda crazy because this auto was around halfway through his path. You can also see that even though Cho wants to be around this hex next to Sivir, he's just too big and his center is almost an entire hex away. Essentially, even though size does seem to technically increase range, the pathing is predetermined with that unit's range in mind. So even though Cho can auto from half the board away, he will still path to be within 1 hex of the target. So this pathing makes that increased range kinda redundant. But overall, it does seem that the bigger your size, the less downtime there is between pathing and autoing. However, the difference is not night and day and it's really hard to notice. Now, as it turns out in TFT, when a unit has increased size, that can actually interfere or block abilities that spread from the initial target. And I think that Leduc explains it perfectly in this video, so I'll play a short clip from that.
Throughout the history of TFT, we've had several interactions where unit size ended up making a difference in an ability hitting or missing. Set 8 is no exception here, and the best way to showcase what I'm talking about is to take a look at Jinx. She fires a rocket that stops at the first enemy hit, stunning and dealing magic damage to everyone in a 1 hex range. However, if Jinx, her target, has a fully stacked Titan's Resolve, which increases the size of the unit, she will now be unable to damage any of the nearby targets, causing you to potentially lose a teamfight.
And I think it's worth noting here that the initial target is not taking more damage and its size is preventing the AoE part of the enemy ult. So unit size can seem to cause bugs that can nullify a lot of damage from abilities that spread from the initial target. Even though this particular interaction was patched out in 13.5, that was just a fix to the specific problem with Jinx's ability. And it's likely that there may be cases in the future or even other examples in this set where this bug arises again. Basically, they patched Jinx's ult and not the fact that size can block abilities like this. Although, it's almost impossible to notice and may only affect 1 or 2 abilities in an entire set. Regardless, changing a unit size mid-round has got to be one of the most fun and hilarious things you can do in TFT. It's an amazing novelty because it's so rare. Seeing a little baby Cho'Gath turn into a Goliath in a split of a second makes playing and seeing this unit so much more fun. Even if it didn't serve a genuine purpose like increasing damage or tankiness, doing this increases enjoyment, at least for me, and even after numerous sets, it's still really funny to see these units just completely overshadow other units and boards. So ultimately, does size matter? And the answer is not really. You may be reducing travel distance, but it's kinda negligible. You may be getting extra autos in, but they're not exactly game changers. And you may be able to block spreading ults, but that is extremely rare. I personally think it's all about the circumstances and technique. Sure, mech jacks may be bigger, but positioning is really important and sometimes smaller units really get in those difficult to reach places. I think the biggest factor that size affects is fun, because it's much more fun when you have a bigger unit because you can play around with it. In regards to the testing itself, it was hard to recreate these circumstances, so do bear that in mind. This is mainly due to the need for target dummies and the time limitations as well. But if there were any issues with my methodology or observations, do feel free to let me know. But yeah, let me know what you think. What do you think about size? Has this video helped or changed any of those thoughts? Was I wrong in some analyses or did I hit the mark? Let me know in the comments and remember to subscribe. Anyways, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me. And as always, thank you for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.